Good afternoon. Good afternoon. If you can hear me, clap once. If you can hear me, clap twice. Rock and roll, let's go. So congratulations on making it to the closing plenary. Yay. Have you enjoyed your experience? Awesome. Remember to provide that feedback when you get your evaluation shortly. We have heard from some great local artists at this convening. We're really glad that we were able to bring arts into the conversation to help us get ready to listen to great panels and discussion. I'm glad to be able to introduce our closing artist, Caitlin Pang. Caitlin Pang is a queer Asian American poet, teaching artist, and youth worker. They write on queerness, dysphoria, and the ghosts of trauma. They were an inaugural member of the Disrupt Slam team at Tufts University and a semifinalist at CUPSI, the National College Slam, in 2016. They founded and currently coaches a youth slam team through AWAY, Allies Working with Asian Youth, which brings together Asian high school youth across community organizations in the greater Boston area to find voice and build community through performance poetry. While not writing or coaching, Caitlin works at the YW, Boston's Youth Leadership Initiative, a social justice leadership program for high school students. Caitlin?
Hi, everyone. How are y'all doing today? Good. So, my name is Caitlin, and my poem for you is about my grandmother. And she is the strongest, funniest, most beautiful person that I know. And I come from an immigrant family. That's something that has really defined my life and has brought a lot of pain and heartache, but also so much beauty and joy. So I'm excited to share one of those stories with you today. And I believe it is more important than ever to speak my family's stories into rooms and spaces whenever possible, especially in these times right now. I just want to give a content warning. My poem does discuss sexual violence and domestic violence. My 84-year-old grandmother is the healthiest person in my family, serves traditional Chinese medicine, herbs, acupuncture needles in the basement of her home in Queens, New York. She's been doing this for decades, ever since she was shoved across the Pacific and the United States rendered her Chinese medical degree archaic, illegitimate, unfound, a goddamn joke. And isn't this what we've been doing for centuries? Healing out of our own hands and tongues, even after they deem us foreign and defunct? She may not have an MD after her name, but she has knowledge white doctors will never be able to touch. She tells me in Cantonese, they do not understand that everything is connected. Tell them I have other knowledges they don't. They do not respect me or my ways of thinking, but it is the best way. I know it is the best way. Know it in the way she takes one look at my tongue, reads the dehydration out of me, asks what is wrong with my stomach. I say nothing. She's been asking what's been wrong with my stomach for years. She calls this yeet hay, which translates to hot air. She says we must be balanced. Yeet hay means too much heat, too much air, and block chi. Chi, life force and energy, connected to the balance of yin and yang. My mother gave me the middle name Yin, cold and hidden like the dark moon. Maybe she knew I'd inherit all this gaslight and unbearable heat. Why do I have so much yeet hay? Probably since the first time a man laid a hand on me, and I have trouble remembering all the violations, but I now know the mind protects the body from what it cannot handle. Everything is connected, like my grandmother says, and I know there is no English word for that. This is not a metaphor. My people's ways of healing and giving back life are not metaphors. My history of sexual violence is not a metaphor. So when I tell you that bruises fade, but he wrote that shit into my DNA, I mean it. When I tell you I've never told my grandmother about my history of wounded men wounding me, but she still knows what I carry in my body, I am not exaggerating. Last month, a doctor sent me to the hospital said she didn't know why I was in so much pain. I sat in the cold room alone overnight, waiting for my test results. And I wanted to tell them not everything in the body can be found with a needle or scalpel, how I don't have to cut myself open to name my trauma with a white mouth. The doctor bursts in at 4 a.m., says the test results show nothing is wrong. And I know what my grandmother means when she says hers is the best way, how you can't locate trauma with an ultrasound or blood test, but with our own hands and tongues like we've been doing for centuries. And my mother doesn't know why I'm like this either. I tell neither of them of how my body flinches with PTSD or how anxiety made my stomach a storming thing, but I think she knows. I can feel it in the way she holds me when I cry, how she stopped speaking my abuser's name into the room and started asking my brother what queer means. I think she knows she raised a fractured thing, the Pacific Ocean spitting back her own reflection. I wish my grandmother taught her this magic. I wish they could read and summon the trauma out of me to sputter up all this yeet hay, all this heat I've been carrying in my body. And most days, my grandmother tells me it is not too late, that I can unblock the hurt and let joy and life flow through my body again, and I want to believe I can. I want nothing more than to excavate every dark and haunted thing in my body. I say I want to dig. I want to dig it all up, get my hands dirty with soil so something else can bloom there instead, something that looks like joy, something that feels like cold air spilling through my body, all spark, no gaslight, a body I can call mine in my own mother tongue.
Wow, that was powerful. Let's just take a minute and sit with the power of that piece before we transition. Just, pause for breathing. Let's just take a deep breath in. All right, thank you very much, Caitlin, for sharing that with us. Now we turn to our closing panel, which will be moderated by Steve Patrick, the Executive Director of the Aspen Forum for Community Solutions and Vice President at the Aspen Institute. And the most important gig is that he gets to work with me every day. Awesome. Come on up, Steve.
All right, come on up, panelists. Let's all take the stage. And I don't know about y'all, but I'm still feeling the power of that poem. So thank you for making it very real. Why don't I just ask the panelists to join me, and if you guys would just come on up together, and then I'll introduce you. I don't mind the security there. Just pass through the metal detector, and thank you. Wow, look at this room. This is exciting. So we're going to have a conversation. Welcome, welcome. And I want to frame it up a little bit and then turn it over to this amazing group of powerful women who are going to take us into greater depth about this discussion. So you all saw that the title of this plenary is The Future of Collective Impact in Turbulent Times. So what do we mean by turbulent times? Somewhat euphemistic language, isn't it? It's, so I brought a few props. So maybe what we mean by turbulent times is front page of the Boston Globe, which incidentally does have the best sports section in America. But for the purposes of this conversation, above the fold, health bill could strip insurance from 23 million Americans. So that's one prop for what we mean by turbulent times. Many of you have probably seen the analysis of what the 2018 Trump budget that was recently put out this week means for some of the safety net systems. And I was going to ask Robert from FSG and the Collective Impact Forum to show a Stephen Colbert clip that kind of sums it up really well, but I knew it would cause panic if I did, so you're off the hook. But let me just tell you what Colbert highlighted, and what, if you just look in your inbox, there's a great email today from PolicyLink and Angela Glover Blackwell, who spoke on this stage in New Orleans 2 years ago at the Collective Impact Forum about what that budget will mean, or visit the Center on Budget Policy and Priorities website, or any number of sites. CLASP has a great piece, but what it really looks like is radical disinvestment. We're seeing, in addition to the healthcare cuts that appear to be on the horizon again with the Senate right now, if you look at it, $272 billion will be cut from SNAP. That's food security. Big cuts in HUD, $15 billion from TANF. And the list goes on. And if you work, and let me see a show of hands, how many of you are working on collective impact that focuses on the justice system? Just some of you are working on the justice. So we know that turbulent times means that it's very possible that the gains we've made in recent decades in a bipartisan, nonpartisan, Koch brothers working with the Ford Foundation to dramatically reduce incarceration in America as a goal, that those gains are now at risk as we see an attorney general who has very much encouraged strict enforcement of laws and mandatory sentencing. How many of you work on immigrant issues? How many of you are in the immigrant space? How many of you know an immigrant? How many of you are related to people who might have been immigrants in your ancestral line? Some of you didn't have a choice, but many folks are here because their relatives sought a better life in America. Immigration, we know, is a huge issue. The rates of arrest are up 30% right now across the country for undocumented people. And actually the rates of arrest for folks who have documentation are up. So, and education. And maybe some of you work on environmental issues. How many of you work on environmental issues? Quite a few. How many of you think global warming might be a threat to all the issues we work on? Well, I encourage you to look at Scott Pruitt's EPA and the direction that's headed. So for me, that's what we mean when we say turbulent times. I thought we would try to get beyond the euphemistic language and think about the impact on the people whose lives we're trying to support in the work of collective impact, of deep cross-system community change. I wonder if we might look at this differently, though, if we might take the long view, and we might also acknowledge that the work in community in these turbulent times becomes that much more important. That the struggle for humanity, for justice, for equity, for opportunity, it doesn't happen on a fast timeline, and it doesn't happen on a linear path. So as I pivot to our amazing panelists, I encourage you to think about that history Dr. King spoke to of the arc of the moral universe bending towards justice. But to acknowledge that it's the work that you all do and the work in community and the work of activist leaders and partners that helps push on that arc, that helps pull on that arc, that helps with that bend. And right now is a time to grab hold and push and pull as hard as we can. So we have the great fortune of having 4 incredible pushers and pullers on the arc to join us in this conversation. I'm going to encourage you all to look at their bios. I may try to weave in some of their incredible history as we have this conversation. But let me just introduce them in the order of the program versus the order of how we're sitting. So first is Kat Allen from Communities That Care Coalition in Franklin County, Massachusetts, my home county. You're pretty much the most rural, one of the most rural places in Massachusetts. Up next is Tawana Black from the Northside Funders Group. Some of you are familiar with Tawana. You probably have read about both of these women. There have been countless FSG and Collective Impact Forum publications about the success of their collective impact work. There's SSIR articles, there's Living Cities in the case of Tawana's work. So I encourage you to learn more about their work since I am not doing justice to their incredible bios. In addition, we've got two folks who have been at the national level for quite some time and are really supportive of the collective impact movement in numerous ways across multiple careers. But for the purposes of this conversation, Heather Peeler is with us from Grantmakers for Effective Organizations. Do we have any GO members in the audience? Sweet. So everybody knows that's where the funders are. Those of you who want to, get a grant. Terrific. Great to have GO with us and great to have Heather here. And last and definitely not least is Ursula Wright, who's now been at FSG for
9 months.
9 months. Congratulations. And Ursula is no stranger to this work from her very high-level work at the Department of Education most recently. So, for example, having led the Promise Neighborhoods work, which may be one of the biggest investors in collective impact that we've had in the last several years. So it's great to have you all here. We hope we can have a conversation. We will open it up with plenty of time for questions from you all in the audience. Welcome to those who are watching via live stream. It is true that live stream does add 10 pounds, just like television
Or 20. Thank you, Steve.
Yeah. And unlike television, it actually adds 10 pounds live as well. So all of us are far more fit than you actually think we are, as you would know. Let me start with Kat, and we'll start local, although the difference between Franklin County and Boston is
sometimes
night and
huge.
day. Boston and Soweto may as well be the. But Kat, can you just first just tell us a little bit about your collective impact work, and then maybe talk to us about how you at the local level respond to the turbulent times, and build on what I shared in terms of the context, would you? Okay. Thanks.
Great. So I'm really glad to be here. Thank you. And our collective impact initiative, our coalition, has been around since 2002. And we are focused on improving youth health and well-being. We have an initiative focused on youth substance use that's been around since the beginning, and we have a newer initiative on youth nutrition and physical activity. And we've met with some really good outcomes. We've gotten all the partners to the table, and I think we're a pretty classic example of a collective impact initiative. As far as how these times change us and affect us, it absolutely has changed us tremendously. I feel like our coalition has been pushed and motivated tremendously. I think we're kind of on fire from what our baseline is. And the biggest change that I could say about our work is I think we really have been empowered to look at the social determinants of health in a deeper way. I think what we find is we tend to work pretty upstream in prevention. We're not doing treatment or intervention for substance use. We're doing work with middle schools around skill building for social and emotional competencies and things like that. And that sometimes feels like we're pushing the community pretty far upstream. This climate has sort of allowed us to push the community even further upstream to look at the social determinants of health, to look at education, access to health care, access to healthy spaces, and access to healthy foods. And I think that what we're seeing is the community is getting it. Our coalition members are getting it and feel really aware that we can't ignore this. This problem is really, this problem of inequity is really front and center, and it's time for our coalition to do something. So we're starting to, look at things like minimum wage and supporting Massachusetts' effort to raise the minimum wage, or the Massachusetts effort around a millionaire tax, because we've had flat state taxes forever. So it's encouraging to see that we can step even further upstream and get involved in more advocacy and have the support from our coalition to do that.
So just to push on that for a second, so what you're saying is the silver lining is that folks are activated and they're willing to take on things that they might not have been in the past. Is that
Absolutely.
a fair?
That has absolutely been true for us. Although we're also now a little bit more aware of the polarization that I think has always been there, but we were perhaps a little more blind to in the past. And so it calls for a greater need for what Marshall Gantz was talking about yesterday, for this relationship building, deep relationship building. So.
That's interesting. Tawana, I just want to ask you to build on that. First of all, thank you for hope and silver lining this in the context of my misery that I led us with. And maybe you want to start there, and then feel free to go to misery if you want to. But what are you seeing on the north side of Minneapolis in this work that you do at a deep level?
Sure. So first, a little bit about the work that we do. So I lead a collaborative of 20 corporate, family, and community foundations in the city of Minneapolis who are aligning their investments with each other and with the city of Minneapolis, Hennepin County, and the state of Minnesota as a place-based funder collaborative in one of the most challenged neighborhoods in Minneapolis, and have been doing that now for several years. And while collaborative philanthropy is not unusual, it's a little bit unusual in that we've taken a collective impact approach, and that our mission is changing the way philanthropy works, which means that instead of just starting with the premise of, okay, how do we pool our funds and give those out and see if we can throw some spaghetti at the wall and see if it sticks, we actually start from the premise that philanthropy owns a lot of responsibility for the inequities that a neighborhood like North Minneapolis faces. And so if you think of the north side, think of whatever your hood is in your neighborhood, in your community, and that is the north side for us. And so everything that we do starts with the premise of what is innate about philanthropy that has caused some of the inequities that we face, and how do we first hold the mirror up to ourselves before we then ask our grantees to do something different, before we ask the government to do something different, the private sector, et cetera. And that's how we go about our strategies. And having been at that now for several years, we are now looking at our work to say, okay, doing this work as a funder collaborative has gotten us pretty far. We've had some really great wins, and it's been good. But 2 years ago, we started saying, but what else is there? And one sector work is great. Cross-sector work is even better. And now, 2 years into having been anchoring the Living Cities Integration Initiative for the last 2 years in our region, now saying cross-sector work is good, but sometimes when it's cross-sector, we're really just elbow to elbow and we're calling it cross-sector, but we really need to be hand in hand. And so what does that mean? Do we really have a cross-sector table, or do we have a single sector table where we gave the most high-profile people from the other sectors a couple seats at our table? And what does that mean if we want to talk about turbulent times? When I think about what's happening in our region right now, while what's in the headlines that you read about is really important, what's important in my state right now is the fact that we began our legislative session with a $182 billion surplus, and yet we just ended it having to go into a special session because of a situation not unlike what's happening in Washington, D.C. Division, division, division. Arguments that make no sense when it comes to whether or not we're really committed to the outcomes we say we are. And waking up to the news this morning while I'm yet here in Boston that our governor just vetoed, I think it's 78 bills that are coming across his desk. So while it looks like we might have had some wins over the weekend and a few more wins going into Monday's special session, we're having to veto those things, right? Because they're not really in the interest of the people. And so thinking about the role of collective impact, the role of the philanthropic sector that I come from, it's really about, okay, what wins are we actually after? Are we actually after preserving the interest of our sector? Are we actually after preserving the interest of our effort? Or are we actually after preserving the interest of the people? And how do we keep that in front of us every day, all day long?
Great. So that's some powerful stuff. So I hear a through line around an increase in thinking about policy and advocacy in place as a response to the turbulent times. For how many of you is that true? Is policy and advocacy now more central to your work? Let me just see a show of hands. Are some of you now thinking, man, policy and advocacy needs to be more central to my work? Is that, all right.
Yes.
Thank you for your honesty in the back there. I appreciate that. So you talked a little bit about philanthropy's role and not necessarily favorably. And it reminds me, and it's a perfect segue to Heather, but when I was at the Gates Foundation, I remember the Greek root of the word philanthropy is love of humanity. And sometimes I watched some of our grants go out and it became a derogatory, I would say, for the love of humanity, why are we making that? Why are we making that grant? And you know, the sort of unintended consequences, it doesn't always happen just in government, it happens in philanthropy as well. Heather, you help to lead a coalition of funders around effective philanthropy. Gio's done a tremendous amount to push on philanthropy towards addressing equity, for example, and inequity. But when you think about where we are in the context of philanthropy and in this moment of turbulence, what are your top of mind thoughts? How does this change how you all approach your work, both in philanthropy in general, but maybe you can bring it to the context of collective impact and community change as well?
Sure, absolutely. So for those of you who don't know GEO, Grantmakers for Effective Organizations, we are a community of more than, I guess, almost 600 grant-making organizations from around the country. So it includes private foundations, family foundations, community foundations, United Ways, government agencies, and the unifying belief of our membership and our community is that grantmakers' success is wholly dependent upon grantees' success. And so therefore, as a community, we must interrogate and examine our practices and push ourselves to ensure that our actions and behaviors actually enable nonprofit organizations to be stronger, more resilient, more vibrant organizations. And so I think in the context of turbulence, that mission of being grantee-centric and putting the needs of the grantees and the communities first has never been more important. And some of the things that GEO has been advocating for, we're about 20 years old, around general operating support, capacity building, deep community engagement. Those themes, again, I think are really, really critical, and we would call them the basics, essentially, of effective philanthropy. But when we talk to our members about what they're seeing in their communities and how they are reacting or responding to the turbulent times, a few themes are coming to head. First is a recommitment to the basics, a recommitment to providing that flexible funding and that general operating support that community organizations need. So I like to think of systems change work as running a marathon. And organizations need to know that there's a water station beyond the first mile. And so often the way grants are structured, there's restrictions or time limitations that don't enable nonprofit organizations to be flexible and to take the long-term view. And so general operating support, flexible funding, multi-year grants are something that I think is part of the basics that all grant makers are re-examining and I think bringing renewed urgency to that type of approach. Something else we're seeing is a degree of responsiveness that is taking different forms. So some of our members are creating rapid response types of funds so that if one of their grantees needs to send lawyers to the airport, for example, to provide some supports for the community, that there's some resources that they can tap into. We've heard examples of other members who are taking a different look at or releasing some of the restrictions around project or restricted funding. So recognizing that maybe they made that grant 10 months ago for a specific project, the context has totally changed, and so they're giving their grantees more flexibility to use those funds as they need in response to the current environment. I'd say the one thing that many of our members are struggling with, and I'd be curious to hear how the panel is responding to this too, is how not to be that passive bystander in terms of everything that's going on. How, as a grant maker, do you not be complicit in the policies that are being put forward that we think are really detrimental to, I think, the shared vision of social change that many of us in the room have. And I think that's where a lot of grant makers are struggling. How to put themselves out there in a way that keeps the focus on the work and not on them as the organization. And so I think that's an area that is hard to navigate for some funders, and how to use their power and privilege, again, in a way that accelerates the work on the ground and not drawing attention to themselves.
So there's another silver lining in what you're sharing, in that it takes the kind of surreal turbulence in which we're currently living, context for grant makers to increase grant making around general operating, flexible funding, policy and advocacy and emergency sort of like responsive grant making. So I guess that's a silver lining. I'm curious to poll the audience again in this sort of informal polling we're doing. How many of you are seeing a different kind of relationship with your grant makers? Or if you're a grant maker, how many of you are changing some of your practice right now in response to, let's just call it the Trump administration? Show of hands. How many of you are seeing shifts? Yeah, I think it takes a little while to reach the ground because I'm not seeing a lot of hands. I saw a few. But I do think this is a moment for those of us who work on collective impact. This is a really important pushback moment. This is a moment where in philanthropy, and I'm not putting words in Heather's mouth, this is me editorializing as the moderator, but this is a moment where philanthropy may have over the last decade or so gone too far in the strategic philanthropy direction. Some people agree with that? Yeah. Maybe even into the hyper-strategic zone of, you can't make a grant without 60 PowerPoint slides that align to the grantees. The grantee won't get in without fitting in those slides. So in this moment, what Heather just described is a great opportunity for those of us who work at the community level to push back. Like right now, the front lines around equity and opportunity and justice are community. And if you as a grant maker don't get that, we need to talk. And so I would encourage you to pick up on the trend line at the national GEO. GEO is not all of philanthropy. It's frankly some of the most forward-thinking funders or members of GEO. And this is a chance to push back. So I just encourage that in what I heard from you. Do you want to give an example or two of specific foundations that are doing some of those changes in these turbulent times?
Yeah. So the example of releasing restrictions and giving more flexibility to grantees, that's something that the Ford Foundation has done in direct response to the recent election. In terms of setting up emergency or quick response funds, the community foundation in my community, the community foundation of the National Capital Region, has set up something like that, and a lot of local funders are doing just that. But the show of hands was not a surprise to me. There's definitely more work that our field needs to do, and it's so frustrating sometimes when we're sitting in a room full of grant makers and they're talking about what is our strategy to respond or address these times, and I keep wanting to say the strategy is easy. Just get the money out the door. We don't have to make it so hard to provide the resources and support that community organizations really need.
Great. I'm curious what you think of all of this, Ursula. So in a way, why don't we start with you with the state of affairs with public funding, and we'll poll the room again. The answer will be again obvious, but you still have to raise your hands, you guys. How many of you are working on initiatives that are dependent on good partnership with good government? Let me just see a show of hands. Yeah. And how many of you are really trying to push to see public investment, public revenue invested in a more effective way in partnership? Yeah. And so in a way, Ursula's work has been about a different way to invest public revenue. Prior to coming to FSG, now you lead FSG's education work, and we all are so lucky to be working with you on that. But talk a little bit about what you're seeing in terms of education, and also in terms of the public investment strategies, and then how do you think about the turbulent times we're in from your perch?
Yeah, so thank you for the question, Steve. I'll start by saying that budgets are always a reflection of priorities. And what we have seen this week from the federal government is a clear indication of its priorities and what it intends to deprioritize. And those deprioritizations are around civil supports and social safety nets, right? And I will say, over and above what is allocated in a budget line item for the US government, there are other ways to deprioritize these social safety nets that we've all been working on, right? There are regulatory ways, and there are a host of other non-financial ways. And so while thankfully the budget as requested by the president will not likely be adopted by Congress as written, we still in this room and as a broader community engaged in collective impact work need to take this signal, if you will, very seriously. And so the way we take that signal very seriously is understanding that the way that we work in community needs to change, right? The paradigm has shifted and the ways of old are no longer going to work as they have in the past. And if we want to continue to serve people in our communities well and provide pathways for opportunity and equity, that means we've got to stretch ourselves beyond our comfort zones. That means, quite frankly, there will be times when even though the appetite, if you will, for advocacy and activism has not been there in the past, it needs to be there, at least on some level, going forward. That means, quite frankly, that we even examine sort of the collective impact construct model in new ways, right? Typically it's a local phenomenon, right? And then for some of these issues, for there to be true impact, we need to think about ways of taking the tenets of collective impact and operating on a national level, right? And that means we've just really got to think about stretching ourselves outside of current boundaries, outside of the current lines that are drawn. Within the education context specifically, I will say that there is still a lot of waiting to see what will happen, which on some level is smart and strategic when you've got limited resources, either human or financial, to work with. But I'll also say, given we are in a place where there is great unpredictability, given that we are now in a place where, quite frankly, there have been enough signals to know that it is prudent to prepare for worst case scenarios, there needs to be more planning for worst case scenarios. And we should be hopeful that these worst case scenarios don't come to fruition, but the absence of getting in front of them, trying to preempt them, trying to make sure that when you think about advocacy, you're not thinking about what else I can get, but what I can protect that currently exists, needs to be part of our mindset. It needs to be part of our paradigm. And I think too often, we've not necessarily felt like we needed to do that. We felt like, government at the local, state, and federal levels, at some level, at some degree, would be the backstop. And I would say these turbulent times challenge that notion.
That's very wise. I see a lot of heads nodding. Anybody want to jump in on that? Any thoughts to build on with that point?
I guess I'll say that that's one of the ways that our coalition has changed to adapt to the current environment also, is that we're collaborating with other coalitions like ours across the state, trying to push forward larger agendas on a state level. In our case, I think also federally too, we need to be doing that, but we need to harness larger power.
And I'll just add, this morning we had an informal conversation amongst some GEO members, and we were talking about this very theme of collaboration and how critical it is, yet there still feels like there's a lot of impediments that get in the way for funders to actually collaborate with one another. So I'm always reminded of that Rahm Emanuel saying about, a crisis is an opportunity, and because it challenges you to do things that you didn't think were possible, something along those lines. And I think that this environment, these turbulent times, are calling upon us to act in ways that we thought before were not possible or not realistic or viable for our organizations. But we have to change that mindset in order to really respond to what's going on.
Well, opportunity certainly abounds for Rahm Emanuel. You want to jump in on that?
And yet, it strikes me. So as we were preparing for this, we had some conversation about, so what are the priorities for collective impact, and how much are we prioritizing things like community engagement and like equity and like collaboration? And when you ask this question about how much we're paying attention, I'm struck to, are we paying attention?
Me too.
Right? Because These things are not surprises.
Right.
They're not surprises. And while we have a new federal administration, these types of shifts have been happening in states for quite some time, right? And so the fact that it's happening in my state right now is really just because they were given permission by a president, right? So we have legislators who are now in houses and senates who feel like now they have free license to be able to say and do what they wanted to do for quite some time, but it's not a surprise. And so I'm asking the question in my region of, do we feel the pain enough now to do what we've known to do for 5 or 7 years? And I'm not convinced that we do. In other states I've lived in, they were feeling some of these pain points a little sooner, so they took action sooner. So someone mentioned in a session I was in earlier, and I think was just mentioned here, are we ready to do action across the country yet? Do we feel the pain enough that we're going to take action? Is that sense of urgency really there? Or are we comfortable enough that we'll wait to see how bad it's going to get? Are these slashes big enough? Is it personal enough yet? I don't know. I mean, you hear you talked about the video you wanted to show, right? And so that healthcare, has healthcare hit your household yet? Or is it 2 steps removed? You did the polling earlier about, do you know an immigrant? Or is one connected to your family? Is it 3 generations removed? Is it 7 years removed? You know, when does the pain become personal enough that a foundation takes action? When does it become personal enough that policy leaders, that private sector leaders start to take action? We're seeing some of that. We're seeing more and more and more. I think it's different in my region now than it was certainly 7 years ago, but it's still not where it needs to be in order for us to not get run over, right, when we get the surprise. And that's, I think, the power of collective action. That's the promise of collective action that we haven't embraced well enough yet to really receive the power of it.
Amen. I think that's probably right. I think it's also interesting, what was your line? It makes sense to be prepared for the worst right now, something to that effect. Do all of you feel like you're prepared for the worst? Let me just see. I don't think so. I don't think we feel that. And then are we ready to really take this movement and put ourselves at risk? Are we ready to step out in the way that Tawana is describing? Let me see. Like, you can do the half a hand. Some of us really are, man. I see the fist is out there. People, this probably is a fist moment. And we may not feel it today, but we may feel it real soon. And so it is best to be prepared. I really appreciate the insights of what you guys are expressing. Let's do a last question for me, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. And I think it probably makes sense, given some of the threads that we've hit on, to end on a little hope with you all. And so we had the Opportunity Youth convening overlapping with the Collective Impact Forum convening. I think most of you caught that. Deval Patrick opened up the Opportunity Youth convening with Hillary Pennington from the Ford Foundation. He said this. He said, "You can't make change without hope." Like, you just can't make change without hope. It makes a lot of sense, at least positive change. Marshall Gans yesterday said change happens at the intersection of criticism and hope. That is, of a strong critique and hope. Something's got to change, and I have hope that it can. Give us some hope from you all. It can be a sentence, it can be a word, it can be it can't be a long diatribe, but it can be a song. Awesome, please no. And no pressure. You can pass, and we'll come back to you after the Q&A with the audience. But where do you see some hope right now? How can you leave us with some hope as we go back to our communities, charged up from this gathering, charged up from the power of this network, of this work? Keep hope alive. Anybody?
Well, I'll start.
Good.
I will say that I am hopeful that these turbulent times has produced a heightened sense of civic awareness and civic obligation. So I think oftentimes people didn't necessarily engage in their communities in informal ways, like running for office or attending school board meetings, et cetera, and even informally really didn't know their neighbors that much. And I am hopeful that these times will put positive pressure on all of us to be much more engaged and much more connected to our community. I think there is power in that. I think there's some safety in that. And And that is at least some kernel of hope I choose to extract from this moment. But I will say, Stephen, and this is not quite in the spirit of optimism, while I agree with the opening quote you made just now, hope is not a strategy, right? So while we need to be hopeful, we also need a strategy to get through these moments.
Very valid. Anybody else want to jump in? Yes. Kat.
So I find for the past 3 days being with all of you here, I've picked up some strategy ideas that I'm really excited to bring back to my coalition. I think we're somewhere between the half raised hand and the fist, our coalition. I said we're kind of on fire. There's a lot of motivation within my group. I've never had better attendance at all of our meetings in the 13 years I've been with my coalition. And what I have gained here is a lot of the how. So how do we engage communities deeper? I was telling Jennifer Splansky-Jester just now that yesterday my head was spinning with all kinds of, we need to do this better, we need to do that better, we know we need to do these things better. And somehow this morning it all gelled, sitting at a table with a bunch of folks and getting a lot of ideas to bring back. And I feel hopeful that we might have a strategy for, going forward and with the hope.
Hope and strategy. That's a nice thing.
Yeah.
Yes.
Albert Einstein said no problem can be created or solved from the same level of consciousness that it was created from. And so I am hopeful because I do feel, I feel like organizations haven't felt that pain point yet. I do feel like individuals from all walks of life are feeling the pain. And I feel like that's taking us as a collective to a different level of consciousness. And from there, new levels of solutions can be created. So in my community, our corporate community is stepping up in ways I've never seen or heard, not only in the community I live in now, but anywhere before. And I think that place of pain that takes us to a new level of consciousness can breed all sorts of innovation and all sorts of willingness to partner and explore and co-create in new ways where we'll really find the solutions.
And I'd say one of the things I'm hopeful about is that it seems that philanthropy is, I think, taking an earnest approach to really addressing structural inequity in ways that I don't think have been present before. I think there's always been conversation about the need for bringing diversity and inclusion into our work in philanthropy, but I think really naming structural racism as a thing to address and putting that out there and being earnest about going after that, to me, gives me a lot of hope that we'll be able to make strides in addressing some of the challenges that really confront our country. And then I would say the other thing that gives me hope is the work that nonprofit leaders are doing every day in communities. I firmly believe the solutions are there in our communities, and it's a resource challenge that we really have as a nation. And I don't know, I'm just really optimistic when I talk to young people or the seasoned nonprofit leader. The work that they're doing, to me, is what fuels my work and the conversations that I'm having with philanthropy.
Fantastic. I'll just do one word for my hope: millennials. I'm not going to put it all on them. We got to be good partners with them, but that's a very large generation of young people who don't have much tolerance for intolerance.
Right.
All right, let's open this up. We got some mic runners, questions for this incredible. There's a lot of little nuggets of wisdom flying off of this this stage right now in this beautiful sofa. And let's add to it. Let's ask some questions. Let's run the mics, see if you guys have a question or a comment for us to build on. Hands? I know it's the end of the conference. Great.
Oh, right here.
Thank you.
Catherine from Kansas City, and I was really struck by the comments that the grant makers had about how philanthropy really needs to kind of catch up with these turbulent times and priorities. And so I'm curious, because so many of us feel like our local foundations and local grant makers aren't there. So I would like to hear from you guys about ways that we can approach them that, that are ambitious but not too safe, and kind of bring them into this moment with us and encourage them to kind of think more strategically in the moment than long term.
Anybody, all of you should feel free to jump in. Approaching philanthropy in this turbulent moment.
Yeah. Oh, do you want to start?
Yeah, I would say, having just been brought into St. Louis to be able to work with a group who wanted to start a group similar to ours, so similar terrain, and I'm from Kansas, so woo-woo for that. You know, I think most grant makers say, don't just bring me in when you need the funds, and so that's not the worst time to be able to strike that partnership, but I think authenticity, so creating that space, so if you can find one who can then find another, so who is the grant maker who is most open to a true deep partnership, right? Who gets on the ground, who rolls their sleeves up, and bring that one person in to be able to really roll their sleeves up and have that authentic, transparent conversation about what it's going to take to get a different set of results than what you're getting today from your partnership. Because 9 times out of 10, I find that there's a grant maker who wants to go deeper in collaboration, to the point that's been shared here. There's always one who wants something different too, but is afraid to say, what is it going to take, right? Grant makers are sitting in rooms already saying, how are we going to collaborate differently? We know we want different results the same way that grantees do. It's just, how do we start to get there? But finding that one or two who can say, how do we come in and have a deeper conversation with arms rolled, sleeves rolled up, but at a time where you're not in crisis about money, because that's the worst time to be able to have it.
Yeah. And I would just add, don't underestimate the power that you have.
Yeah.
So the relationship between foundations and nonprofit organizations is codependency. They need you in order for them to fulfill their missions. And so don't forget about that. And be relentless in helping them understand why investing in your sustainability, your health as an organization, is absolutely critical to addressing the issues in your community that you're working to confront. And I know that gets exhausting when you're constantly saying, yes, thank you for this, special project grant, but we really need funding to pay for our rent, or we really need funding to pay for professional development for our staff, or we really need that IT system that will help us collect the data that you're asking us for. Like, I know it gets really exhausting, but just stay at it and reminding them about why that organizational support is so critical to getting the outcomes that you're both after.
Can I piggyback on that? Yes, it's exhausting, and yes, people should stay at it, right? I think there were 2 very important lessons that the presidential election sort of lifted up, right? One is about storytelling, the ability to market, right? If you can do that well and you can repeat your message in a clear, succinct way, even if that message has no tethering to reality, as we've seen, it is a message that resonates, and it is a message that people buy into. And I think too often in the not-for-profit community, too often in our collective impact efforts, we're so heads down working that people don't know our story. And we have got to be very intentional and very strategic about lifting those stories up. That should be core to the work of any backbone. That should be core to the work of any sort of major partner in a strategic collective impact effort.
Great. The one thing I would say, and I was going to try to avoid this for this conversation, but it is very true, because I didn't want it to sound like pandering, that now more than ever, this work is on the front lines of what we need in a moment of not normal, as the tagline says. And so I do think, as you talk to philanthropy, they're not always connected to folks who are connected to the ground where the pain is being felt, where the unrest is real, where the trauma, like the trauma we heard in the poem before this session, is actually alive and rising. The pain of being an immigrant, of being a young African-American male in a community where the school-to-prison pipeline might get turned back on. Not that it's been completely shut off at all. So I do think that's part of the argument with philanthropy. Like, are you relevant or not? Because we're relevant. Our work's relevant in these communities. Let's go to another question. We're kind of running short on time. We'll take 1 or 2 more. Yes, the fist in the back. Gentleman right there, yeah. We'll have the mic runners race to you, since you're in dead center. Whoever gets first gets a free pass to the next Collective Impact meeting. Yes.
Thank you. This is very inspiring. If we agree that we are in the business of systems transformation, then a metaphor comes to mind that Joanna Macy often uses, the metaphor of the midwife. hospicing the death of defunct systems that are no longer serving, and birthing these new systems that are resilient going into the future. And if that's part of what we're about, dismantling on the one hand and creating on the other, my question is, how do we build bridges for those people kind of going down with these systems we're dismantling into these new systems, these visions that we have for the future? I can make it concrete. I can say the fossil fuel industry we're dismantling, and a renewable energy system is being born. Right? How do we build bridges for the coal miners in West Virginia, to get from the one to the other? Thanks.
I have another example of that. I'm not going to answer the question, but another example from our work is, if I mentioned that we're looking at, do we work on the minimum wage, raising the minimum wage in Massachusetts, and some of our members who are service providers are concerned about, because the federal reimbursement rates are, not going to change with our state legislation changes. How do we ensure that services continue to be provided? So that's just another example, like your example of fossil fuel industry. But
other thoughts? I mean, the disruption's crazy to try to respond to.
Yeah.
But it's important.
Yeah, I think appreciation for knowledge comes to mind for me. If I think about our work in workforce development, is a system we're trying to desperately disrupt, and workforce centers and WIOA disruption. And when I think about on-the-ground conversations we've had with state employees and county and city employees who feel like, okay, there comes Tawana again, here to destroy all of us and get rid of all of our jobs. And in reality, that's not it. I am trying to greatly improve outcomes, though. And at the same time, their knowledge about what they've been doing and why it hasn't been working is vastly important to the new system we're trying to build, right? Their knowledge about why the funding patterns keep them doing the work the way that they've been doing it is hugely important, so that we don't build a system that incents them to do things the same way, right? All of that knowledge is important, and I think that's important when we think about how we bridge from current to the next system that we're building. We have to have that. And relationships can't be underestimated, not unlike philanthropy to grantees, not unlike the grassroots work that happens on the ground. Those relationships are still there, and you don't make up for that, no matter how wonderful the next generation of new systems is. So thinking about that knowledge transfer being important, but investing in it, ultimately, at the end of the day, I think is an area that we tend to skip over. We invest in the new innovation, but not in the civic infrastructure, not in the training that's needed to be able to bring people along, and we can't forget that.
And I'll just add, this is one of the reasons why I'm optimistic about how many in philanthropy are truly embracing their work from a racial justice lens or racial equity lens, because as you mentioned, Tawana, it's important for grant makers to understand what their role in the system is and how they are, through unintentional ways, perpetrating inequity in communities. And so by examining and being committed to racial equity, I think it creates an opening for grant makers to think about how they can behave differently in ways that do create equity in communities. So that's where I'm optimistic about where you can bridge, I guess, the difference between one system to the next, and that's by having that awareness of the role that you play and why the status quo is supported in the way it is.
Terrific. Unfortunately, we are just about at time. I'd love to do a couple things. One is, I'd love you all to, if there's anything you didn't want to miss saying before you left, if there's something you want to make sure you leave on the table for this audience or on the podium or wherever we are, please share that final thought about the moment we're in and the work you do and what we need to keep our energy up as we go back in this struggle. And then we can finish with a quick close from our colleagues, and we'll all go back and change the world as we're doing right now. So final thought, final nugget, if you have it. You don't feel obligated, but I don't want you to miss the chance to steer folks in the right direction right now.
So I guess I just want to speak to the grant makers and the funders in the room, and just to encourage you, those who are already providing flexible funding, multi-year funding, investing in capacity building for your grantees, keep on doing that. And for those of you who aren't, I really encourage you to consider that as perhaps the most effective strategy to support your grantees in the way that they need to during this turbulent time.
I guess I'll say, I'll finish a comment or a point I started a little bit earlier in this session and perhaps dropped. I mentioned earlier there were two lessons from the most recent presidential election in my mind. One we talked about already in terms of marketing and promotion. The other, I think, is the sort of very real sort of consequences that result, the negative consequences that result when segments of a population are ignored and undervalued, right? And so as we engage in our collective impact efforts, it's really important to have an open table, to really keep equity at the center so we don't fall in situations where we think, oh, I can speak on behalf of X group, I can speak on behalf of Y group, or this one individual for this one meeting can speak on behalf of everyone, despite the fact that this is a multi-year collective impact effort. That is something that will be detrimental, I think, to long-term sustainability for the good work you're all trying to do. So let us take another lesson from the election to sort of guide us in our day-to-day activities.
So I guess for me, the big take-home message from everything in the last 3 days has been about relationship building and bridge building and how incredibly important that is right now. Both in terms of community engagement and how do we deepen those relationships, also building relationships and bridges with people that disagree with us, and how do we begin to bring people along with us. And as the gentleman out there spoke about, when we're disrupting systems, how do we build those bridges and build relationships so that, as Marshall Gantz said, the success of an initiative is not whether you won or lost at that particular campaign. It's whether you are building the power of the movement and deepening those relationships as you go. So that was a powerful take-home message for me over this meeting.
And I'll go back to the beginning of the session as well, that in my work, I spend a significant portion of my time leveraging the social and political capital of our 20 foundation members, just as much as we leverage their financial capital on behalf of the goals in the community that we work in. And for the last several years, I've said pretty loudly that I felt like there are rooms and places that I can be in that our grantee partners and our organizers and grassroots people can never and will never be in, and that it was just as important for me to do that work as it is for them to be on the streets with a bullhorn doing that work. And that's true. And yet, as I think about these turbulent times, they call for a different type of work, and they sometimes are going to call for us all to be in the same room with the CEOs of corporations that I'm navigating with our governor and with our mayor and with elected officials right alongside those grassroots organizers. And that's gonna be different work for us. As we think about collective impact, I wanna challenge us, particularly for philanthropy, who has oftentimes the leverage and the power and influence to be able to create spaces and tables that no one else does. And we don't often use that influence to be able to do that. So I wanna challenge those of us in the grant making space to use that social and political capital to create new spaces and new tables that are going to be called for, I think, for us to really take on these turbulent times to achieve, again, that equity and opportunity for the people that really are at the heart of our work.
Wow. So to summarize, policy and advocacy, more. Push philanthropy, more. Deepen equity, more. Relationships, more. And really prepare for the worst, which none of us have done. We just haven't. And in the end, everything we do is, you do, maybe not everything. I think every once in a while somebody's like surfing for shoes on the web or whatever. But almost everything you do in your work is so necessary. And let's just be real, it's not sufficient. Like, it's not like we can do that much more, but that is what turbulent times call for. We have to do a little more in these spaces and places with the advice and counsel of our sage and wise final panelists. So You know, Sherry Brady hates the fact that I am a more is more person, but this is a time for more from all of us, and I know we're tired. I hope you're energized from the Collective Impact Forum convening so you can go back to the work you do, which now more than ever is so important. So thank you, panel. Thank you, audience. Let's thank these guys for their time. We're going to come down. Thank you, guys. Can I keep the mic on for a second? They always try to turn it off. I just want to also just ask Robert and Sherry and Jen just to take a bow for this incredible work. And Tracy, wherever Tracy is. Thank you. Thank you, Collective Impact team. Thank you. Are you going up? Yeah. All right.
Yes, thank you, Steve, Tawana, Kat, Ursula, and Heather for what I think was really a call to action in these turbulent times for all of us in the room. And I always can count on Steve for weaving a little humor in, but also leaving us with some really sage marching orders. So I will speak for myself in saying that the conversations over the past few days have really been particularly resonant for me in these times, both, as our panelists said, in providing some hope and also some strategy and tools to move our work forward. And as we said on day one of our time together, you know, collective impact isn't a fixed formula. It's an approach to social change that continues to evolve. And we hope that the work is and can continue to be informed by what we're learning as a learning community, whether it's the wisdom of Marshall Gans about the role that community organizing can play in parallel or in complement with our efforts, or if it's thinking about new ways to engage our private sector partners, or what we can learn from colleagues doing this work internationally. I think that this field of practice really continues to evolve, and that the experience I know that I've had over the last 3 days has really continued to push that forward.
And I will say that for me, it's really been about the connections, really seeing people who are working really hard on social justice issues, both from the collective impact side and from my other job, the Opportunity Youth Incentive Fund work. It's really been really important to see these connections and how this work is not easy work, right? It's hard, and we're sort of pushing that boulder uphill constantly, and to be in a room, in a hotel, in a, you know, in sort of convening space with people who are also pushing these boulders uphill, I think is very important. And so we're really hoping that you made connections and networked with people here who can be those supports that you, when you're like, damn, I can't do this anymore, why are we doing this? You can pick up the phone or drop an email, and there's someone out there who can help you sort of have that conversation and work through those. So we really hope you found some peer support here as well. So I know I'm all but standing between you and freedom, so let me make this quick. We again would like to thank our sponsors, and there's a list of them, and our, we also would like to continue to thank our local outreach partners who helped gather you all here and send out the call to get folks here. So thanks to them. I would also like to add to the shout out that Steve just gave, a thank you to Robert and to Dulcie Gregory, who is our conference manager extraordinaire, who the logistics of this had to be a nightmare, God bless her. And to our colleague Tracy Timmons Gray, who really has been keeping an eye on the live stream and a lot of the social media stuff that's happening. So thank you guys to them, and if we could just give them another round of applause. Great. And also, we will gather the slides and the materials, and they'll be sent down in electronic form. And so we'll get that out to you in a couple weeks, hopefully, and also the live streams of each of the plenary sessions are already available on YouTube, but we will also be sending out a link to prettier copies of those. But if you're really excited to relive it, you can see those right away. And with that, we wish you safe journeys, near and far, and thank you for spending this time with us. We really appreciate it. Yeah.